I am an American, born and bred. It's obvious, right? Just look at me. I am a white, privileged American. I am never scared when I get pulled over by the cops for speeding, which happens more than I should admit to. I have a college degree. I have a good job. No one hardly ever asks me where I'm from, let alone tells me I should go back there. I was born in New Jersey, so going back wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But where I was born is a different question than where I come from. And the answer to where I come from is a little bit more complicated. My great-grandparents came to America through the port of New York in 1914. And though they were allowed into the country and welcome to get on the path to citizenship, it became very clear to them very quickly that they were not welcome here. That though they came to this country looking for a better life, people like them, people from where they were from, they were told where to live in a ghetto of sorts with others of their ilk, and the jobs they could get weren't very good. So my great-grandpa, he got a job working in the silk factories of Paterson, New Jersey, where they settled down with others of their type. And my great-grandparents gave up on the dream of having a better life for themselves. But they still wanted that better life for their children, and they knew what they had to do. They had to breed the other out of them. They had to diminish the immigrant stain. They had to teach their kids to lose their heritage and to be Americans. They had to teach them to get rid of any of that stigma, that stench of being an Italian. My grandparents had some control over what they could do. I mean, their kids looked Italian, but they tried to dress them as well as a factory worker's salary would allow them. They always made sure their kids were clean because Italians were known to be dirty. And they insisted that their children only speak English. My Italian-only speaking great-grandparents raised their kids in an English-only household. Of course, when the parents, my great-grandparents, speak Italian and the kids are little, some of that gets through, right? So over the generations, over the years, some Italian has made it down from my great-grandparents' ears to mine. A few of them are very choice words that I cannot share with you because there are children in the audience. But one word from the old country I can share. And that word is probably the most important word in the Italian language. Mangia. If you don't know, it means eat. And Italians, like Americans, like to eat. Of course, I would argue that Italians do it better. Food, Italians do it better. If that is not on a t-shirt, someone please put it on one and give it to me. I would love that. The irony is, of course, that food is part of the reasons that Italians had the reputation they had for being stinky. My dad would tell me stories of growing up in his grandmother, my great-grandmother's house, and how everyone in the neighborhood and on a Saturday afternoon would get out the big pot and they'd throw in the tomatoes, which Americans did not like at the time, and they'd throw in the onions, which Americans did not like at the time, and they'd throw in the garlic. Who would do such a thing? And the house would smell. It would fill with the scent of the sauce. And then if there was any money, they would go to the butcher and they'd buy whatever meat they could afford, which the funny thing is sauce was peasant food. And then as the day wore on, the whole house would fill with this stench. The whole neighborhood of others like them, the Italian neighborhood, would fill with the smell of the sauce. And at the end of the day, the family would sit down at the table. My great-grandpa would serve the sauce, and they'd munja. My grandpa grew up in that house, and he became a man, and one Friday night he went out roller skating, because that's what you did back in the 30s. And as he was roller skating around the rink, his eyes landed on a beautiful French-Canadian woman. Think Juliette Binoche meets Rosie the Riveter. And as much as Gertrude caught his eye, well, Mario caught hers. And as Mario, an obviously Italian man, skated towards her, the only thing that Gertrude could think was, my, he looks so clean for an Italian. Well, Gert and Mario were smitten. And not long after, Gertrude brought Mario back to meet her family. Her parents were immigrants themselves from Canada who had come to this country to give their kids a chance at a better life. But they didn't face the same stigma that Italians had, the newly classified as whites Italians. So they weren't too sure about Mario. They weren't sure that they wanted to let their daughter take a step back by marrying an Italian. But here's the thing, Canadians, like Americans, like Italians, like to eat. So one day, my grandpa Mario cooked up a big batch of sauce, and he carried it over to Gert's family's house, and he served the sauce, and they mangied. And when they were done, it must have worked, because Gert and Mario got married. And then Mario, like a good first-generation American, when World War II broke up, he signed up for the Army, and they started their family. My dad, Dave, was the firstborn, and Mario served his time in the Army. And then when he got out of the Army, he went back to Patterson, and he went back to looking for work. But Italians still were not so popular right after World War II, and so the only work he could find was as a sign maker. And as the years went by, Gert and Mario ended up with 9 children. They were good Catholics. And they did their best to give their kids a chance at a better life, because even though their kids were only half Italian, they still shared that status. They still had that last name. And so they made sure their kids were always clean, and their kids were always dressed as well as a sign maker's salary could allow. And they made sure their kids were well educated. There was no money for college, that wasn't gonna happen, but they made sure their kids studied hard and worked hard to try to give them whatever edge they could have. And on a Saturday afternoon, Mario would get out the big pot, because Gert never did learn how to cook. And he'd throw in the tomatoes and the onion and the garlic and whatever meat was on sale at the butcher if they could afford it. And as the house filled with the smell of our family sauce, they'd sit around the table and they'd munja. And the next day they'd eat from the same pot, and the next day and the next day until it was gone, because that's all they could afford. My dad grew up to be a tall, thin, fair-haired, light-skinned man. When he was 19 years old, he enlisted in the Navy, and he served his time and got out just as Vietnam was breaking out. Great timing there. And then he came back to Patterson, and he went to look for a job, and partly because he was well educated, and partly because of the way he looked, and partly because it was the 60s, man. The times, they were a-changin'. He didn't have a problem getting a good job. And one Friday night, after a long day at work, he walked into a bar, and he saw a beautiful Polish woman. Think the grown-up Shirley Temple. And his eyes locked on hers, and her eyes locked on his, and they were smitten. And not long after, Annie brought Dave, my father Dave, back to her parents' house, her Polish first-generation parents' house. And whether it was because they hadn't had to deal with the same stigma that my Italian family had, or whether it was because they came here with money, or whether it was just because they really, really wanted to leave any stench of the old world behind, Annie's parents said, no, we're not letting an Italian in the family. Annie and Dave got married anyway. But my mom's family wasn't at the wedding. Fortunately for everyone, they had 3 gorgeous kids. The third one was definitely the best. Third time's the charm. And both sets of grandparents did love us, although we were kind of the black sheep of the Polish family. And whether it was because of the tension with the race issue, or whether it was because of the million other reasons, my parents got divorced, and my dad moved back to Paterson, and we stayed in our home in the suburbs. And my mom never really learned how to cook. So I would look forward to those Saturdays when my dad would come down, usually with a couple of his siblings, and he'd get out the big pot. He'd bring it himself, because my mom didn't have one. And he'd throw in the tomatoes and the garlic and the onion, and the house would fill with the most delicious smell. And then he'd go and he'd get whatever meat he wanted, because he could afford it. And at the end of the day, we would sit around the table and we'd manja. I have grown up to have a college education, to have a great job. I was born as a white, privileged American. But thanks to my father's stories, I will never forget where I come from. And thanks in part to the fact that on a Saturday afternoon, I have been known to take out the big pot, to throw in the tomatoes and the onion and the garlic, lots of vino, celery, which is a controversial ingredient, but I like it, and whatever meat I feel like making, because I can afford it. My American family won't forget. And as the stench, the delicious, delicious stench of my family sauce fills up the house, my American family and I sit down at the table and we manja.